How to have fun anytime, anywhere. Step 1. Go to ChumbaCasino.com.
ChumbaCasino.com. Got it.
Step 2. Collect your welcome bonus.
Come to Papa welcome bonus.
Step 3. Play hundreds of casino-style games for free.
That's a lot of games. All for free?
Step 4. Unleash your excitement.
Woohoo!
Chumba Casino has been delivering thrills for over a decade. So claim your free welcome bonus now and live the Chumba life. Visit ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Share it with me at nightwatchfiles@gmail.com. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. And be sure to stick around until the end, where I'll read a couple of the first emails we've received. Maybe yours is one of them. Let's unravel this together. At 12:45 p.m., on July 27, 2008, the Sunday heat clung to Boston streets as Clark Rockefeller strolled through Beacon Hill with his daughter, 7-year-old Snooks, and social worker Howard Yaff. To any onlooker, they were just another trio enjoying the lazy hum of a July afternoon. Clark had chosen the outing carefully, an innocent ride on the swan boats, a symbol of tranquility disguising his storm of intentions. Down the street, a black SUV idled. Behind the wheel sat Daryl Hopkins, a limo driver who believed he was simply helping an old friend. What he didn't know was that Clark had rehearsed every move, every second, to ensure this moment would unfold seamlessly. As they reached Marlborough Street, Clark slowed, feigning discomfort. "My back," he murmured, setting Snooks down. In a calculated moment, he directed Yaff's attention to a detail on a nearby historic building. This distraction provided the opportune moment for Clark to execute his plan. With a sudden shove, Clark sent Yaff stumbling backward. The social worker barely had time to react before Clark yanked the SUV's door open, his fingers locking around Snooks' wrist. In one violent motion, he pulled her inside, her small body colliding against the doorframe. Her doll tumbled onto the sidewalk, forgotten. Yaff lunged forward, his hand grasping the door handle. "Go! Go!" Clark barked, his voice slicing through the air. Hopkins hesitated for only a heartbeat before slamming his foot on the gas. Tires screeched. The SUV lurched forward, dragging Yaff for several agonizing yards before his grip failed. He collapsed onto the pavement, pain igniting through his body as the vehicle sped away. Inside the SUV, Snooks sobbed, clutching her head where it had struck the door. Hopkins glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his unease growing. Clark barely looked at her. "At least we got rid of Harold," he muttered, using his misnomer for Howard Yaff. His mind was already elsewhere, on the road ahead, on the plan still unfolding. Sandra Boss grew up in Seattle, Washington, in an upper-middle-class family. Her father was an engineer at Boeing, and she was raised in a nice 2-story Cape Cod house with a finished basement. Even from a young age, she demonstrated a highly competitive nature, particularly with her fraternal twin sister, Julia. Both Sandra and Julia were recognized as National Merit Scholars during their senior year at Blanchette High School. An article in the Seattle Times in 1985 noted their close relationship, stating, "They've never spent more than 3 days apart." Despite this closeness, Sandra's competitive spirit led her to choose a different path from her sister when it came to higher education. While Julia wanted to attend Yale, Sandra declared her intention to go to Stanford. Sandra pursued a degree in American Studies at Stanford University, along with a secondary major in economics. She was described as sharp but shy, eager for success, but socially on the outside looking in. After graduating from Stanford, Sandra continued her academic pursuits, earning an MBA from Harvard Business School. Sandra held positions in the business and finance sectors. She worked in an elite private equity program with a Dallas real estate giant, attracting the best and brightest. She also held a position in debt markets with Merrill Lynch, where she was involved in pricing derivatives. These early career moves showcased her talent and ambition in the financial world. The initial encounter between Sandra Boss and Clark Rockefeller occurred in New York City in the spring of 1993, a period when Boss was exploring summer job opportunities. At the time, Sandra was 26 years old and preparing to enter her final year at Harvard Business School. The connection was facilitated through Boss's twin sister, Julia, who had become acquainted with Rockefeller through their shared involvement at St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue. While Julia's formal membership status at the church remains uncertain, she regularly attended services there. Sandra Boss first spoke to Clark Rockefeller on the phone. Subsequently, he learned that Sandra was in town and extended an invitation to a party he was hosting. The party was a clue party, inspired by the board game. Guests were instructed to dress as characters from the game. Rockefeller himself assumed the persona of Professor Plum, a Harvard archaeologist known for his discomfort when questioned about his past. Sandra Boss attended the party as Miss Scarlett, a Hollywood actress whose career was faltering and who was seeking a wealthy marriage. According to Tom Reiser, a friend of Rockefeller's, the party was deliberately arranged by Clark to meet Sandra. Reiser indicated that Rockefeller had initially been interested in Sandra's sister, but she was already in a relationship. Sandra, friends noted, was immediately taken with him. Sandra Boss recalled that Rockefeller mostly engaged in small talk during the clue party. However, after she returned to Boston, he contacted her, expressing his desire to see her again. Boss agreed, viewing it as a pleasant prospect. Although she was on a career track and not particularly looking for a long-distance relationship, she found him appealing. Boss's previous relationships had been unsuccessful, partly because the men she dated felt intimidated by her intelligence. Rockefeller, in contrast, celebrated her intellect, which she found appealing. She admitted that she was drawn to the fact that someone like Clark Rockefeller was very enthusiastic about the idea of getting to know me and being romantically involved. She was drawn to his intelligence, his knowledge of classic literature, his dedication to the church, and their shared philanthropic values. He was attentive, polite, kind, and complimentary.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Born into the Rockefeller family, Clark's early life was steeped in the traditions and expectations of one of America's most prominent dynasties. Although he intimated belonging to the Percy Rockefeller branch rather than being a direct descendant of John D. Rockefeller, there was an understanding he was part of the extended family. From a young age, he would have been aware of his family's legacy of philanthropy, business acumen, and social influence. Growing up in a grand Sutton Place townhouse in New York, Clark was immersed in a world of privilege and sophistication. He claimed that from his backyard, he could observe the steeples of Queens peeking out over his fence. Clark had an exceptional education. Some accounts suggested he attended Yale University at the young age of 14, showcasing his intellectual capabilities. The setting of New York City provided a backdrop of cultural richness and social opportunities. Clark spent time at the family estate in Pocono Hills, New York, further solidifying his connection to the Rockefeller legacy. As a young man, Clark developed a keen interest in the arts, culture, and intellectual pursuits. He cultivated an encyclopedic knowledge of various subjects. His passion for art led him to amass an impressive collection, including works by renowned artists such as Robert Motherwell, Clifford Still, Piet Mondrian, and Mark Rothko. He displayed an encyclopedic knowledge of art, effortlessly lecturing others on abstract expressionism and captivating them with his insights. Clark's expertise extended to music, as he could play the didgeridoo and identify vocalists in various recordings of Cole Porter's From This Moment On. Clark's social life revolved around exclusive clubs and gatherings, where he interacted with other members of high society. He frequented establishments such as the Lotos Club and the Metropolitan Club, where he was greeted with deference and respect. These clubs provided a space for intellectual discourse, networking, and the forging of connections with influential individuals. Despite his privileged background, Clark possessed a down-to-earth charm that endeared him to many. He was known for his preppy attire, often sporting khaki pants, a Lacoste polo shirt with the collar turned up, and a Yale baseball cap. He believed in the alligator logo and embraced the classic New England aesthetic. He was affable and eager to please, genuinely interested in others and making them feel valued. Before meeting Sandra, Clark pursued various business ventures involving finance or international affairs. He advised foreign governments on monetary policy. Clark traveled extensively. Despite his family's wealth and influence, Clark encountered personal challenges and setbacks. He faced pressure to live up to his family's expectations. It was also said his fortune was sadly encumbered by a lawsuit. The death of his parents in a car crash also shaped his worldview and influenced his relationships. Perhaps these events instilled in him a desire for independence and a need to forge his own path. Clark Rockefeller was a complex individual shaped by privilege, intellectual curiosity, and a desire to make his mark on the world. After the Clue Party, Clark contacted Sandra to express his interest in seeing her again. Despite her career focus, Sandra agreed to light dating during her visits to New York. This marked the beginning of their courtship, with Clark making efforts to align with Sandra's values and interests. As their relationship progressed, Clark shared details about his life, including the tragic loss of his parents in a car accident when he was 18. This revelation evoked sympathy from Sandra and created a sense of intimacy between them. He also spoke of his work in debt renegotiation for small countries, portraying himself as someone devoted to helping others. By the summer of 1993, when Sandra moved to New York for a job with Merrill Lynch, their relationship had deepened. Despite the end of her summer job and return to Harvard in the fall, they continued their relationship long distance, with Sandra driving to New York at least twice a month to see him. During this time, their connection grew stronger, with both considering each other as boyfriend and girlfriend. Within months of meeting, they were discussing marriage. Sandra found Clark's quirks endearing, such as his love for Star Trek and his attentiveness to his dog, Yates. He would cook for the dog, brush the dog's hair every day, and insist on bringing his dog to events. These eccentricities, while unusual, added to Clark's charm and made him stand out from other potential suitors. In the spring of 1994, Clark proposed to Sandra during a trip to Islesboro, Maine, presenting her with a Tiffany & Co. ring selected with the help of her sister, Julia. He would later contend that he spent every last penny he had on the engagement ring. Sandra accepted, and they traveled to Seattle for Clark to ask her father for her hand in marriage, which William Boss granted. Sandra was introduced to Clark's aunt and cousin, Alice Johnson, at their apartment in the United Nations Plaza, who welcomed her warmly. The Quaker wedding ceremony of Sandra Boss and Clark Rockefeller, held on October 14, 1995, on Nantucket Island, Massachusetts, was a unique event distinguished by its simplicity, lack of formal structure, and personal significance. The choice of a Quaker ceremony was influenced by Rockefeller's desire to avoid legal formalities in public records, as well as a dispute with St. Thomas Church. The setting for the wedding was the historic Quaker Meeting House, a building constructed in 1838 to house a congregation that had previously gathered in the home of Mary Coffin Starbuck, an early Quaker. The meeting house provided a stark and simple backdrop for the ceremony. In contrast to traditional weddings, the Quaker ceremony was notable for its absence of an officiant. Instead, the 7 guests, including Sandra's parents, her sister and brother-in-law, and 3 individuals associated with the Nantucket Quaker Meeting House, sat on stiff wooden pews. Clark's Gordon setter, Yates, served as best dog, highlighting the unconventional nature of the event. The wedding proceeded in silence until the bride and groom felt moved to speak. Sandra and Clark stood facing each other and then recited their own vows. The specific content of these vows remains unknown, but they reflected the couple's personal commitments to one another. Following the brief ceremony, the newlyweds and their guests retired to a restaurant for a celebratory dinner. Sandra and Clark then spent their first night as a married couple in the small house that they had rented and enjoyed a week-long honeymoon on Nantucket Island. Sandra and Clark established their life primarily in New York, with a secondary residence in Nantucket. Sandra dedicated herself to her career at McKinsey & Company, while Clark managed Asterisk LLP, an advisory firm for third-world countries. Their everyday life in New York included a mix of professional pursuits and social engagements. Sandra's work at McKinsey involved advising major corporations, institutions, and governments. This required long hours and significant travel, and, as a result, Clark assumed many of the household responsibilities. The couple maintained a presence in elite social circles, gaining membership to exclusive clubs and attending high society events. Despite these positive aspects, there were challenges and tensions within the marriage. One significant source of stress was the couple's finances. While Sandra earned a substantial income at McKinsey, Clark's work did not seem to generate any income. This led to financial strain and disagreements about financial management. Clark managed Sandra's finances, depositing her checks, paying bills, and filing taxes. As time progressed, Clark's behavior became a growing concern. According to Sandra, he became increasingly controlling and difficult. She claimed that he was directive about her movements, insisted on walking her to and from work, and attempted to control her interactions with friends. He would cut off her contact with them and would scream at them. In late 1999, Clark claimed to have had a nervous breakdown after a fight with a bystander in Central Park that led to a police encounter. He also claimed that his work was very stressful and that some of his clients had run into severe problems because of the Asian financial crisis. The incident seemed to exacerbate his existing issues and led to further changes in his behavior. The family moved from New York to Nantucket, then to Woodstock, Vermont, and finally to Cornish, New Hampshire. These moves seemed to be driven by Clark's desire for a more secluded and controlled environment. As a rising star at McKinsey & Company, Sandra was dedicated to her career and sought to make a meaningful impact in her field. However, Clark's behavior and demands increasingly clashed with her professional goals, creating a sense of conflict and unease. By the end of 1999, Sandra was about to be made a partner at McKinsey & Company, which would make her one of the youngest partners in the firm's history. By this time, she was making major money, which was still controlled by her husband. Particularly in the early years, he was unhappy with the limited amount that I earned at my job and put a lot of pressure on me about it, she said. The cumulative effect of these factors led Sandra to realize that she needed to make a change in her life. As she spent more time away from Clark, she began to feel stronger and more independent. In the summer of 2000, she decided to leave him, taking a small apartment in New York and telling him that she needed to figure things out. She started to finally come to the conclusion that she needed to change her marital status.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Following Sandra Boss's decision to leave Clark Rockefeller in early 2000, Clark actively sought to win her back. Clark reverted to the man Sandra had originally fallen in love with, employing a variety of tactics to regain her affection and convince her to reconsider her decision to end the marriage. One notable strategy was a return to the charming and attentive behavior that had initially attracted Sandra to him. He showered her with attention, gifts, flowers, and jewelry, lavishing compliments on her in an effort to rekindle the romance. Clark made a concerted effort to be attentive and romantic again. Clark's efforts extended to borrowing expensive jewelry, which he presented as having come from the Rockefeller family, for Sandra to wear to a party. She later surmised that the jewelry had been borrowed from a friend, but at the time, Clark's gesture was intended to impress her and evoke a sense of connection to his family legacy. Clark also presented a new friend who vouched for him and claimed to have known him since childhood. The friend was meant to reinforce the idea that Clark was a trustworthy person, as well as someone with a long history and established relationships. Sandra admitted that she reveled in the attention that Clark was giving her during this period. She liked it, but she wasn't decisive about it, and still went along with her plans to separate. During this period of re-romancing, Clark and Sandra conceived a child. Clark had taken Sandra to bed, and she later claimed that she and Clark used condoms for birth control, but she thought that Clark had altered the condom. Sandra decided to stay with Clark because she thought that they should make a go of it. The birth of Ray Storrow Mills Rockefeller, also effectively known as Snooks, on May 24, 2001, at Dartmouth-Hitchcock Medical Center in Lebanon, New Hampshire, marked a pivotal moment in the lives of Clark Rockefeller and Sandra Boss. However, Clark's actions surrounding Ray's birth and early life reveal a complex dynamic that deviates from conventional parental expectations. Despite the significance of the occasion, Clark was notably absent from the hospital during Ray's birth. While Sandra was in labor and giving birth to their child, Clark was nowhere to be found. His whereabouts remained unknown to Sandra, and he did not visit his wife and newborn daughter until 18 hours after Ray's birth. This absence raises questions about his priorities and commitment to his family during this crucial time. Instead of being at the hospital, Clark chose to spend those initial hours interacting with the locals of Cornish, New Hampshire, further entrenching himself in the community he had come to inhabit. This decision underscores his tendency to prioritize his own social agenda over the immediate needs of his family, hinting at the self-centeredness that would later define his actions. Sandra, having taken a 3-month maternity leave from McKinsey, became Ray's exclusive caretaker during those early months. She said that she and Ray were inseparable, while Clark spent very little time with their daughter. However, Clark's engagement with Ray began to evolve as she grew older. By the age of 2, Ray began reading, and Clark started to connect with her intellectually. As she developed, Clark took charge of her life. With Sandra traveling all week for work, Clark had full control of their daughter, their house, and her checkbook. After Sandra Boss decided to give her marriage with Clark Rockefeller another chance, the couple made a significant move to Cornish, New Hampshire. This relocation was influenced by a combination of factors, including Clark's desire for a more secluded environment and Sandra's growing dissatisfaction with their previous residences. The move to Cornish marked a new chapter in their lives, filled with both challenges and attempts at integration into the small, close-knit community. Sandra found their current residence and lifestyle unacceptable and threatened to leave Clark if things did not change dramatically. It seems that Clark acquiesced to the move to Cornish in an attempt to appease Sandra and keep their marriage intact. Clark used $750,000 of his wife's money to purchase Doveridge, the former estate of the renowned jurist Learned Hand. The New York Times described Cornish in February 2010 as a town of about 1,700 on the banks of the Connecticut River, with 2 general stores, a post office, a church, and miles of pines, oaks, farmland, and rolling hills. The town had been made famous by Augustus St. Gaudens, the great late 19th century sculptor, who helped turn it into a popular summer colony for artists, including the painters Maxfield Parrish and John White Alexander. President Woodrow Wilson even spent a few summers there, making the home of writer Winston Churchill, no relation to the British Prime Minister, his summer White House. Upon arriving, Clark and Sandra attempted to integrate into the community. They attended local events and social gatherings, seeking to establish connections with their new neighbors. Jim and Judy Brown, known for their astute judgment of character, even hosted a welcoming party for Clark. This was in keeping with the tradition of small communities to welcome new neighbors. Despite these efforts, Clark's behavior often struck others as odd. His interactions with locals were sometimes marked by arrogance and a tendency to put others down. For instance, he lectured Senator Burling's wife, Jean, about abstract expressionism in a condescending manner. Gene Burling, a veteran judge, quickly detected that something was not quite right with Clark. Clark also engaged in various projects and activities that raised eyebrows in the community. He took on the role of Mars, the god of war, in a play at the St. Gaudens National Historic Site, and he signed his name to a series of articles in the town newsletter, one of which appears to have been plagiarized from a speech by best-selling author Michael Crichton. He also began a series of never-finished construction projects at Doveridge. "I think he was trying to see how fast he could spend her money," Don McClay said, referring to Sandra. Clark's attempts to assert himself in Cornish society sometimes backfired. He clashed with town officials, such as Marilyn Bourne, the chairwoman of the Cornish Board of Selectmen, over various issues. For instance, when Clark offered to donate money to the town if they accepted a church from Senator Burling and sold it to him for $1, his offer was met with skepticism and resistance. Sandra, on the other hand, was often absent from Cornish due to her demanding job with McKinsey in New York. She commuted between Cornish and New York, spending much of her time in hotels or on the road. Her absence contributed to a sense of isolation and made it difficult for her to fully integrate into the community. Despite their efforts, Clark and Sandra's time in Cornish was marked by a sense of unease and a growing distance between them. Clark's behavior became increasingly erratic, and Sandra struggled to balance her career with her family responsibilities. The isolation of Cornish added to the strain, and Sandra began to feel trapped in a situation that was becoming increasingly intolerable. Clark cultivated friendships with some neighbors, like Laura White and her family, becoming a regular presence in their lives. He would visit them almost daily, especially around mealtimes, never bothering to knock on the door. He was also included in intimate parties for birthdays and such. However, even in these friendships, Clark's behavior was often outlandish. Laura's son and his friends called Clark Purple Pants because he always wore purple pants. Clark also hated to have his picture taken and would strike poses that disguised him in every photograph. He had total disdain for local laws, and when Marilyn Bourne ever called him out for driving without a license, he would just sneer. He also made grand gestures of his largesse, offering to buy the highway department a backhoe, but Bourne would admonish, "Stop talking to Clark. You can only get yourself into hot water. It is never good for anyone. He is not giving us anything, because he doesn't give anybody anything." Clark had a caustic encounter with Alma Gilbert Smith, the founder of the Cornish Colony Museum, when she sought to include pictures of his home in a book about the homes and gardens of Cornish artists. He told her, "Well, you don't have my permission. I am a very famous person. I don't want anyone to know where I live. I forbid you to take any photographs." Clark also launched a scathing rebuke against the women who had shut off his pump at Blow Me Down Brook, threatening them with legal action and criminal charges. He instructed Max Bloomberg to make it clear that he never bluffed. In the end, the women offered a feeble apology, and in a surprising turn, Clark responded with a gift of honey and his own apology, claiming he hadn't realized they were women of such prominence in the community. Clark stirred up virulent opposition to the town accepting the donation of Trinity Church from Senator Peter Burling. He told anyone who would listen that the church was a wreck, not properly restored, and the town shouldn't take this on. The move to Boston's Beacon Hill marked a significant shift for Clark Rockefeller, driven by his wife Sandra Boss's career and his own desire to immerse himself in a community that would further legitimize his personal identity. This transition from the rural setting of Cornish, New Hampshire, to the prestigious urban environment of Beacon Hill was strategic, reflecting Clark's ambition to enhance his social standing and access a more affluent and influential network. Sandra Boss's career at McKinsey was flourishing, and she sought to consolidate her professional life in Boston. She wanted to spend more time with their daughter, Ray, and insisted that they move to Boston and enroll Ray in school. Clark acquiesced to the move, but he would require suitable accommodations. They found a 5-story, ivy-covered townhouse at 68 Pinckney Street on Beacon Hill, one of Boston's oldest and most expensive neighborhoods. The price was $2.7 million. Beacon Hill, with its 19th century architecture and rich community life, was home to Boston's wealthiest families, known as Boston Brahmins. Senator John Kerry, for example, had a house right around the corner. After moving to Beacon Hill, Clark took on the primary responsibility of caring for his daughter, Ray, whom he often referred to as Snooks. This arrangement suited his purposes, allowing him to immerse himself in the community and cultivate relationships with other parents and neighbors. Every morning, Clark would walk Snooks to the bus stop in front of Cheers, the bar that inspired the popular 1980s television show. This daily ritual became a social opportunity for Clark, who soon found a new constituency among the Beacon Hill lawyers, Harvard researchers, architects, and business people who frequented the nearby Starbucks. Clark's attentiveness to Snooks was often remarked upon by those around him. He would take her to the Athenaeum Library, where he would read to her, fostering her intellectual development. Neighbors often saw them strolling through Beacon Hill, dining together, and spending hours reading books, which was the initial route Clark took to connect with his daughter. In addition to intellectual pursuits, Clark also made sure Snooks experienced art and culture. He claimed to have given his daughter and her friends a tour of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, whose collection he knew extensively. However, beneath the veneer of parental devotion, Clark's behavior was often controlling and manipulative. He insisted that Snooks go by his wife's last name, Boss, instead of Rockefeller, to avoid reverse discrimination. He pressured her to learn quickly and became very routinized about what she would eat and what she would wear. He dressed her exactly the way he dressed himself, with the same little Izod or Lacoste shirts, khaki pants, LL Bean lobster belt, and topsiders without socks. Clark's interactions with other parents were also marked by a desire to impress and assert his dominance. He told one parent that he had sold his jet propulsion company to Boeing for $1 billion and that he was positioned exclusively in treasuries. He also claimed that he could get Snooks into Spence, a private girls' school in New York, with one phone call. Clark's image as a devoted stay-at-home father was reinforced by his active role in Snooks' education. He volunteered at the Southfield School's Clay Center for Science and Technology and even floated the idea of donating a planetarium. However, his relationship with school officials was often strained. He had a habit of using the promised donation as leverage, implying that the school should be more accommodating and lenient toward his child. Sandra, meanwhile, grew increasingly uneasy about Clark's behavior and its impact on Snooks. She disagreed with his parenting style, but initially held on to the hope that he would ease up, that they would share parenting responsibilities, that he would allow Snooks to have friends, and that he would start behaving more reasonably. However, as she later put it, that was not true. These growing concerns, combined with the strains in their marriage, ultimately led Sandra to the decision to divorce Clark in December 2006. Initiated in January 2007, the divorce quickly escalated into a complex legal battle, with both parties vying for custody of their daughter. Sandra's decision to file for divorce in January 2007 marked the beginning of a year-long period of intense negotiations and legal wrangling. Seeking to regain control of her life and protect her daughter, Sandra hired a lawyer and initiated the process of disentangling herself from Clark. Clark, on the other hand, reacted to the divorce proceedings with anger and defiance. According to a friend, Clark was furious at the prospect of the divorce. Desperate to maintain his position, Clark vowed to obstruct Sandra's efforts by interviewing every divorce lawyer in Boston to create conflict of interest restrictions. Additionally, strapped for cash, he attempted to liquidate assets, asking people to buy back antique cars and furniture he had acquired during the marriage. He told one art dealer, Sheldon Fish, that Sandy only wanted my money. She married me because I'm a Rockefeller. The custody of Ray emerged as the central point of contention in the divorce proceedings. Sandra, determined to ensure her daughter's safety and well-being, sought to limit Clark's access to Ray, citing concerns about his behavior and his influence. She expressed fears that he would kidnap her. Clark, however, fought to maintain his role as a devoted father leveraging his close bond with Ray to bolster his case. As the divorce proceedings progressed, Sandra grew increasingly suspicious of Clark. Prompted by inconsistencies in his personal history and revelations about his deceased mother, Sandra hired a private investigator to dig into Clark's background. The findings confirmed Sandra's worst fears. Clark was not who he claimed to be.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
The unraveling of Clark Rockefeller's carefully constructed identity began with Sandra Boss's growing unease and intensifying doubts during their divorce proceedings, eventually leading to a full investigation and the revelation of his elaborate deception. The seeds of suspicion were sown long before the formal investigation, with inconsistencies and oddities in Clark's personal history gradually raising red flags for Sandra and her family. One of the earliest indications that something was amiss stemmed from Clark's ever-evolving accounts of his family background. Initially, Clark had told Sandra that his mother was the late Mary Roberts from Southern Virginia, but he later changed the story, claiming that his mother had been a child actor named Ann Carter. This abrupt shift in his narrative raised Sandra's eyebrows, and she found it odd that he had never mentioned it before. As Sandra's father, William Boss, began to scrutinize Clark's background, he stumbled upon information that further fueled their suspicions. While researching Ann Carter, Clark's purported mother, William discovered that she was, in fact, still alive. This revelation sent shockwaves through the family, as it became clear that Clark had fabricated a significant aspect of his identity. According to William Boss, something's wrong here. This discovery served as a pivotal moment, prompting Sandra to question everything she thought she knew about her husband. Further adding to Sandra's growing doubts was an incident involving their taxes. As they prepared their tax returns, Clark vehemently opposed using their longtime accountant, Phil, and insisted on handling the matter himself. His behavior struck Sandra as peculiar, and she suspected that he was attempting to conceal something. As Sandra explained, he started slamming Phil as being incompetent and the wrong guy, and we shouldn't use him. Driven by these mounting concerns, Sandra finally resolved to uncover the truth about her husband's identity. After more than a decade of glaring warning signs, Boss began to suspect that her husband was a fraud. She hired a private investigator, Frank Rudwiz, to delve into Clark's past and ascertain his true identity. She provided the private investigator with every single thing that Clark had told her about himself and requested them to go find out who he is. Initially, though, she was less interested in who her husband was than in whether or not he had stashed any of her cash. As she told Rudwiz, millions of her hard-earned dollars had flowed through Clark Rockefeller's hands. Rudwiz's investigation yielded startling results, confirming Sandra's suspicions and exposing the extent of Clark's deception. Despite the high-profile name, the investigator found no record of his life before meeting Sandra. This wasn't a 17-year-old kid who was just starting out in life. This was a grown man with a high-profile name who, from his own account, had a very substantial life prior to meeting Sandra Boss. He found no employment history, relatives, addresses, passport, or credit cards that weren't paid by Sandra Boss. There was not even a marriage license issued to Clark Rockefeller and Sandra Boss. There is no record of this guy. There are no addresses, Rudwiz reported to Sandra's attorney. He had, in short, absolutely no trace of a pre-Sandra life. This prompted Rudwiz to conclude that we don't know who he is. We know he's not Clark Rockefeller, but we don't know who he is. The private investigator proved, A, that nothing Clark had said was provable, B, he couldn't figure out who he was. Faced with the overwhelming evidence of Clark's deception, Sandra took decisive action to protect herself and her daughter. In consultation with her lawyers, Boss settled on a plan. She knew that Clark despised courtrooms, so she decided to make what she called a big play. Her lawyers put every single thing about all the bad treatment, as well as the endless and unfathomable lies, into an affidavit, which they filed in the probate court where the Baugh/Rockefeller divorce was being handled. Then, they waited to see how Rockefeller would respond. In exchange for Sandra's agreement to grant him $800,000, Clark conceded to her demands regarding custody and relocation. Sandra was granted full custody of Ray, and she was permitted to move with her to London, effectively limiting Clark's access to their daughter. As part of the settlement, it was stipulated that Clark's visits with Ray would be supervised and restricted to 3 times a year. He would also need to meet with her therapist before and after. Moreover, both parties agreed not to write a book about their experiences. In addition to the monetary payment, Clark was given 2 cars, a dress, and Sandra's engagement ring. The divorce settlement was finalized, marking the end of Sandra and Clark's tumultuous marriage and ushering in a new chapter in their lives. While Sandra sought to create a stable and secure environment for Ray in London, Clark was left to grapple with the consequences of his deception and the loss of his family. On a Sunday in July 2008, Clark, who had been residing at Boston's venerable Algonquin Club, a temporary haven amidst the fallout of his marital separation, was scheduled to spend the day with Snooks. A social worker named Howard Yaff was mandated to accompany them during this visit. The seemingly ordinary outing, a planned trip to ride the swan boats in the public garden, served as a facade for Rockefeller's carefully conceived plan. Unbeknownst to Yaff and the casual observers in the affluent Beacon Hill neighborhood, where Clark had previously lived in a substantial townhouse, a black SUV was strategically parked down the street. Behind the wheel waited Darrell Hopkins, a limo driver who had previously befriended Clark and was under the impression that he was assisting Rockefeller with a discreet matter. Clark had even rehearsed the swift entry into the vehicle with Hopkins, practicing the maneuver in front of the Algonquin Club's valet parkers. As Clark, Snooks, and Yaff strolled along Marlborough Street, Clark feigned discomfort, claiming his back was hurting, and placed Snooks down. In a calculated moment, he directed Yaff's attention to a detail on a nearby historic building. This distraction provided the opportune moment for Clark to execute his plan. He suddenly shoved Yaff, creating a physical barrier, and swiftly opened the back door of the waiting SUV. With alarming speed, he pulled his daughter into the vehicle so abruptly that the doll she was carrying flew from her hands, and she struck her head on the doorframe. Yaff, realizing the gravity of the situation, scrambled to his feet and attempted to intervene, grabbing the handle of the closing back door and trying to get inside. However, Clark issued a vehement command to Hopkins. "Go! Go!" Hopkins immediately accelerated, causing the vehicle to drag the clinging social worker several yards before he was forced to release his grip, falling to the pavement and sustaining injuries. Inside the departing limo, Snooks was crying, clutching her head, which had collided with the doorframe during her father's forceful action. Hopkins, glancing in the rearview mirror, inquired about her well-being. Clark, however, appeared unfazed by his daughter's distress and the assault on the social worker, remarking that they had at least gotten rid of Harold, his misnomer for Howard Yaff. Rockefeller then directed Hopkins with a series of rapid instructions, dictating turns until they arrived in front of a cab parked outside a White Hen Pantry convenience store on Beacon Hill. Abruptly altering his purported plans for Newport, Clark announced his intention to take Snooks to Massachusetts General Hospital to assess her head injury, stating he would use the waiting taxi for this purpose. He instructed Hopkins to wait for him in the parking lot of a nearby Whole Foods, providing an envelope containing cash. However, Clark's destination was not the hospital. Instead, he directed the taxi driver to the Boston Sailing Center. There, waiting for them in her white Lexus SUV, was Aileen Ang, a piano and flute teacher and web designer whom Clark had befriended. Clark had previously contacted Ang, requesting a ride to New York City, falsely claiming his boat was docked there and offering her $500 for her time and gas. He implored Ang to hurry, emphasizing the urgency of catching a train that would supposedly take them to a boat launch on Long Island by 8 in the evening. The journey to New York was fraught with heavy rain and significant traffic, stretching to nearly 7 hours. During the drive, Ang noticed multiple missed calls on her phone, but Clark instructed her to ignore them. Meanwhile, Snooks and her father engaged in conversation, games, and songs. At one point, Snooks uttered the now poignant words, "I love you too much, Daddy."
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to chumbacasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to chumbacasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
As they approached New York City, Clark directed Ang towards 42nd Street and 6th Avenue, stating they would take a cab to Long Island from there. However, when they were stopped in traffic near Grand Central Terminal, Clark's deception continued. In a sudden move, he gathered his daughter, tossed an envelope containing $500 onto the front seat, and exited the vehicle without even a farewell. Moments after their abrupt departure, Ang's phone rang. The caller inquired about her Rockefeller friend's first name. Ang, bewildered, responded with, "Clark." The caller then revealed the shocking truth. Clark had just abducted his daughter and assaulted a social worker, triggering an Amber Alert across Massachusetts. Ang, realizing she had unwittingly aided in a kidnapping, exclaimed that they had just left her car. She was urged to contact the police immediately. Meanwhile, back in Boston, a dazed and injured Howard Yaff managed to call 911 to report the kidnapping. He then contacted Sandra Boss at her hotel, delivering the devastating news. Sandra, upon hearing that her daughter had been taken, rushed to the scene, understandably distraught and frantic. The carefully constructed facade of Clark Rockefeller had shattered, revealing the desperate act of a man willing to commit serious crimes to defy a court order and reclaim his daughter. The kidnapping set in motion a nationwide and even international search for the man who had successfully concealed his true identity for decades. Sandra Boss, already suspicious of her ex-husband's true identity following their contentious divorce proceedings, informed the responding Boston police officers that Clark Rockefeller was not who he claimed to be. This revelation immediately complicated the search, as authorities realized they were pursuing an individual with an unknown background. As Boston police began entering the name Clark Rockefeller into national databases, they found no record. When they questioned Sandra Boss about identifying information such as a driver's license or social security number, she responded in the negative, further underscoring the elusive nature of the suspect. His credit cards were under her name, and his cell phone was registered to a friend. This lack of any verifiable identification presented a significant obstacle to the initial search efforts. Within 24 hours of the kidnapping, the Federal Bureau of Investigation joined the search, with Special Agent Noreen Gleason of the Boston Field Office taking a lead role. Gleason's initial inquiries included contacting the Rockefeller family, who unequivocally stated that there was no connection to the man calling himself Clark. Simultaneously, an Amber Alert was issued concerning Clark Rockefeller's abduction of his daughter, raising public awareness of the situation. Authorities began tracking down various leads, many of which were based on the false pretenses Rockefeller had established with his friends, telling them he was embarking on trips to different destinations such as Bermuda, Peru, or the Turks and Caicos Islands. These misleading accounts led investigators on a wild goose chase across the country and even internationally. The search intensified as tips poured in from around the globe due to the extensive media coverage. However, a crucial piece of evidence emerged from a friend of Rockefeller's in Boston. Clark had visited this friend the night before the kidnapping and had used a water glass, which the friend had not yet washed. Investigators swiftly obtained the glass, and fingerprints were lifted and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis. While awaiting the fingerprint results, the FBI released pictures of Clark and his daughter to the media, hoping for identification. This public dissemination triggered the emergence of individuals who recognized the man under different aliases he had used throughout his life. Some identified him as Chris Gerhardt, a former film student. Others recalled him as Christopher Chichester, from a wealthy Los Angeles suburb in the 1980s, who had vanished after being sought for questioning in a missing persons case involving a California couple. He was also known as Christopher C. Crow, a purported TV producer who had worked for Wall Street firms. Scores of people knew him as the Boston Brahmin, Clark Rockefeller. The fingerprint analysis finally yielded a definitive result. The abductor was not a Rockefeller, but Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter, a 47-year-old German immigrant who had arrived in the United States in 1978. This revelation provided a crucial breakthrough in the investigation, shifting the focus from the fictitious Rockefeller identity to his real persona and his history in the U.S. Further investigation revealed Gerhardsreiter's potential connection to a decades-old missing persons case in San Marino involving John and Linda Sohus, who disappeared in 1985. The discovery of human skeletal remains in the backyard of their former residence in 1994 had raised questions about Christopher Chichester, an alias Gerhardsreiter had used while living with the Sohuses. Despite the unveiling of his true identity, locating Gerhardsreiter and his daughter remained a challenge. Numerous reported sightings across the country and abroad proved to be unfounded. However, the search eventually focused on Baltimore, Maryland, due to the observant actions of several individuals who had interacted with Gerhardsreiter under the alias Chip Smith. Julie Gochar, a real estate agent in Baltimore, recognized the man in news reports as Chip Smith, who had recently purchased a carriage house through her agency. Beth Grinspoon, a bartender who had interacted with Smith, also made the connection. Cindy Neuberger, another associate at the real estate agency, further corroborated the identification after watching news reports. Gochar provided the FBI with details about the house on Ploy Street, her client's catamaran at a local marina, and his local cell phone number. Surveillance was established at the Ploy Street residence. Knowing Gerhardsreiter had a boat, the FBI devised a ruse. The marina manager called Smith, falsely claiming his boat was taking on water to lure him out of the house. When Gerhardsreiter emerged from the residence, FBI agents were waiting. They called out, "Hey, Clark!" He turned around, and when asked where he was going, he replied, "I'm going to get a turkey sandwich." This would be his last lie before agents apprehended him. Simultaneously, other agents stormed the house and safely recovered his daughter.
Hello, it is Ryan, and we could all use an extra bright spot in our day, couldn't we? Just to make up for things like sitting in traffic, doing the dishes, counting your steps, all the mundane stuff. That is why I'm such a big fan of Chumba Casino. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere with daily bonuses. That should brighten your day a little. Actually, a lot. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com. That's ChumbaCasino.com.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
The capture marked the end of an intense 5-day search, fueled by the unraveling of a complex web of deceit that had defined the life of the man known as Clark Rockefeller. Back in Boston, Noreen Gleason informed Sandra Boss that her daughter was safe and her ex-husband was in custody. Boss reportedly collapsed upon hearing the news and then asked the pivotal question that had driven the entire search. Who is he? Christian Karl Gerhardsreiter's life before he assumed the identity of Clark Rockefeller was characterized by a pattern of assumed personas and a consistent striving for recognition and acceptance within affluent circles. Born on February 21, 1961, in Siegsdorf, near the small resort town of Bergen in the Bavarian Alps, Germany, he was the first child of Simon Gerhardsreiter, a Catholic house painter and amateur artist, and Irmengard Gerhardsreiter, a Catholic seamstress. His birth certificate listed his parents and their residence in Bergen. Growing up in Bergen, a close-knit village of around 5,000 people, Gerhardsreiter was described as a misfit, and an aloof young man who believed he was destined for a more significant life outside of Bavaria. A childhood friend, Thomas Schweiger, recalled that Christian enjoyed playing games where he adopted different identities. This inclination towards assuming roles manifested early. At the age of 13, he reportedly impersonated a millionaire from Holland in a phone call to a government office to inquire about registering 2 Rolls-Royces, successfully persuading a skeptical clerk. Herbert Willinger, an inn owner in Bergen who attended school with him, noted that Gerhardsreiter often expressed his disdain for Bavaria and asserted that a better life could only be found in America, even proclaiming, falsely, to have secured a job at a radio station in New York. In his quest to leave Bergen, Gerhardsreiter encountered Peter Rockefeller, an American, whom he immediately attempted to impress. He claimed to have grown up in the area with considerable privilege, identifying his father as an industrialist in a high-level position at Mercedes-Benz. This encounter highlights his early efforts to fabricate a background that would elevate his status in the eyes of others. Gerhardsreiter immigrated to the United States in 1978, arriving in Boston on December 16th at the age of 17. He informed his parents that he had secured a position as a disc jockey in New York City, leading them to agree to send him monthly financial support while he settled. Upon arrival, he possessed a German passport and a resident alien identification card. Following his arrival in Boston, he traveled to Connecticut to meet a high school student he had befriended during a Eurail trip the previous summer. He also spent time in Loma Linda, California, residing with Dr. Elmer Keln and his wife. The Kelns later recounted their experiences with Gerhardsreiter, noting his penchant for posing for photographs and their eventual realization that he was not truthful about his background. His first significant assumed identity in the United States was Christopher Chichester, which he adopted in the early 1980s in San Marino, California. Presenting himself as new to town, he claimed to be a descendant of the Chichester family in England and stated that his mother was residing at the family home in Switzerland. He purported to be in the United States to study communications or television at the University of Southern California and portrayed himself as a poor relation of British nobility. Chichester cultivated relationships within the wealthy community, becoming popular with the city's widows. He asserted a connection to Sir Francis Chichester, the famed solo circumnavigator, even showing a newspaper article about him. Some residents found him impressive and believed him to be of significant standing. During this time, he also presented himself as an aspiring film student, sometimes claiming to be a teacher's assistant at USC's film school. This period is also marked by his association with John and Linda Sohus, who disappeared in 1985. He was sought for questioning in their disappearance after their truck turned up in Greenwich, Connecticut in 1988, and skeletal remains believed to be John Sohus's were later discovered in their former San Marino backyard. Following his time in California, Gerhardsreiter resurfaced in Connecticut in late 1988 under the alias Christopher Crow. He attempted to sell the Sohus's truck. In Greenwich, he once again gravitated towards private clubs and older women, presenting himself as someone who pretended to own the place at the Indian Harbor Yacht Club. He successfully gained an interview with venture capitalist Stan Phelps and was hired as a computer whiz at S.N. Phelps and Company. Crow presented an image of wealth, wearing custom-made shirts with his monogram CCC and a Burberry raincoat, claiming to be a producer from Los Angeles who had worked on Alfred Hitchcock remakes. Around this time, a librarian in Greenwich who knew him well stated that any traces of a German accent were gone, indicating a significant transformation in his speech. Crow then secured a position as a sales manager of corporate bonds at Nikko Securities, although a colleague noted that he had no experience in this area. He continued to impersonate a wealthy aristocrat, frequently mentioning his supposed relatives Lord Mountbatten and the Battenberg family and a family foundation that purportedly owned luxury cars and European castles. He also worked briefly at Kidder, Peabody & Co. in Manhattan before abruptly quitting, claiming his parents were missing in Afghanistan. It was after this period, following several unaccounted for years, that he devised his most elaborate and enduring persona. Clark Rockefeller. He moved to New York City, determined to leave his past aliases behind, telling friends a fabricated story about his parents being killed in Connecticut. He began to intimate that he was connected to the Rockefeller family, setting the stage for his most significant and longest-running deception. The immediate aftermath of Clark Rockefeller's arrest in Baltimore was marked by a mixture of relief, shock, and a burgeoning need for answers from those who had been deceived by him. Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter, still in his Clark Rockefeller persona, was taken to an interview room at the FBI's Baltimore office. Despite being handcuffed and dressed in dirty clothing, similar to what he wore during supervised visits with his daughter, he reportedly maintained an air of control. During a 4-hour interview with FBI agents, he initially avoided direct answers about his identity, even stating, "Clark Rockefeller does not exist." When pressed about his other known aliases, such as Christopher Crow and Christopher Chichester, he similarly denied their existence, at one point insisting he did not know his own name. As news of the arrest spread, the elaborate facade Gerhartsreiter had constructed over decades began to crumble publicly. The media extensively covered the capture, focusing on the audacious kidnapping and the unraveling of his false identity. Sandra Boss, in an impassioned video plea aired on television, appealed for her daughter's safe return, a message that underscored the emotional toll of the abduction. Gerhartsreiter was subsequently escorted back to Boston to face charges that included kidnapping of a minor and assault and battery with a deadly weapon for using his SUV during the abduction. Even in handcuffs and surrounded by guards, he reportedly appeared outgoing and eager to engage with reporters, though his escorting officer prevented him from speaking. His legal representation began with veteran Boston criminal attorney Stephen Rones, whose fees were to be paid from Gerhartsreiter's remaining divorce settlement. As the media frenzy intensified, Rones initially encouraged his client to speak to the press, adopting a strategy of fight fire with fire and emphasizing Gerhartsreiter's love for his daughter. In his first attempt to present his side of the story, Gerhartsreiter, accompanied by his attorney, appeared on NBC's Today Show from the Nashua Street Jail. Despite his incarcerated state, he reportedly acted as if entering a private club, shaking hands with the crew and maintaining an aristocratic demeanor, even remarking, "Normally, I would enjoy this moment." A subsequent interview with the Boston Globe further revealed Gerhartsreiter's perplexing state. He greeted the reporters with a cheerful demeanor, introducing himself repeatedly as Clark Rockefeller, and bowing slightly to each, still embodying the persona he had cultivated. This behavior aligned with a profiler's analysis, suggesting a deep entrenchment in his assumed identity. As the legal proceedings in Boston moved forward, Gerhartsreiter's defense strategy began to take shape. His attorneys, Jeffrey Denner and Timothy Brattle, admitted that he had indeed kidnapped his daughter and acknowledged his history of invented personas. Their primary argument, however, was that Gerhartsreiter was not criminally responsible due to insanity. The 12-day trial in May 2009 captivated the public and the media. Witnesses recounted how they had been deceived by Gerhartsreiter, most notably his ex-wife, Sandra Boss. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney David Deacon, portrayed Gerhartsreiter as a master con man who believed the rules did not apply to him. Gerhartsreiter himself did not testify, allowing his lawyers to present his narrative. The jury, comprised of individuals who had largely remained unaware of the extensive media coverage, deliberated for 5 days. While they were unanimous in their belief that Gerhartsreiter was a fraud and had kidnapped his daughter, they grappled with the question of his sanity. Ultimately, they concluded that his actions were not the result of delusion, but rather the calculated plan of a self-centered narcissist who felt entitled to take his daughter and the divorce settlement. On June 12, 2009, the jury delivered a guilty verdict on the most serious charges: kidnapping of a minor and assault and battery by means of a dangerous weapon. Gerhartsreiter stood during the verdict, appearing wild-eyed but remaining silent. While one charge of providing a false name to the police was dropped, the defense's plea for a light sentence of less than 2 years was rejected. The prosecution argued for the maximum sentence of up to 15 years, and a statement from Sandra Boss was read to the court, detailing the nightmare of her child's disappearance and her fears given the revelations about her abductor's past. Judge Frank Gaziano, in delivering the sentence, emphasized Gerhard Reiter's disregard for the law and the anguish he had caused Sandra Boss. He sentenced Gerhard Reiter to 4 to 5 years for kidnapping and 2 to 3 years for assault with the SUV, to be served concurrently. In the aftermath of the trial and sentencing, Christian Karl Gerhard Reiter continued to be referred to as Clark Rockefeller in the public sphere, and even by himself. 1 year after his trial, his petition to reduce his sentence was denied. His defense attorney maintained that Gerhard Reiter had no involvement in the disappearance of John and Linda Sohus.
Hey, it's Ryan Seacrest. Life comes at you fast, which is why it's important to find some time to relax. A little you time. Enter Chumba Casino. With no download required, you can jump on anytime, anywhere for the chance to redeem some serious prizes. So treat yourself with Chumba Casino and play over 100 online casino-style games, all for free. Go to ChumbaCasino.com to collect your free welcome bonus. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
For those who had been affected by his deceptions, the arrest and subsequent revelations offered a degree of closure, but also left lingering questions about the true nature of the man who had so skillfully manipulated them for so long. The unmasking of Clark Rockefeller as Christian Karl Gerhard Reiter brought to light a lifetime of constructed identities and the profound impact of his elaborate con games on numerous individuals. The discovery of his personal belongings, including his birth certificate, German passport, and various identification cards associated with his different aliases, in a suburban basement, served as a tangible reminder of the multifaceted deception he had maintained. The investigation into the disappearance of John and Linda Sohus, a case that had remained largely dormant for nearly a decade, experienced a significant resurgence following the arrest of Christian Karl Gerhard Reiter. Gerhard Reiter had lived in the guest house of John Sohus's mother, Didi Sohus, in San Marino, California, in the mid-1980s under the alias Christopher Chichester, around the same time that John and Linda disappeared. The catalyst for the renewed interest in the Sohus case was the discovery of human skeletal remains in the backyard of Didi Sohus's former residence in May 1994 during the excavation for a swimming pool. The television program Unsolved Mysteries featured a segment in January 1995 titled San Marino Bones, which brought national attention to the decade-old mystery and highlighted Christopher Chichester as an intriguing character who had lived with the Sohuses and then vanished after their disappearance. Forensic anthropologists determined that the skeletal remains were those of a slight young man, consistent with the physical description of John Sohus. While DNA testing was not possible due to John being adopted and his biological parents untraceable, the jeans and flannel shirt found with the remains matched John's typical attire. Although there was no definitive evidence like bullet holes to confirm murder, the fact that the bones were dismembered and buried in separate plastic bags suggested foul play to investigators. Furthermore, a luminol test conducted in the guest house where Chichester had resided revealed a significant amount of what was believed to be blood on the cement floor. Timothy Miley, a sergeant in the Homicide Bureau of the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department and the lead investigator on the revived Sohus case, theorized that Chichester had manipulated Didi Sohus, an alcoholic and increasingly reclusive woman, into believing that John and Linda had abandoned her. This manipulation, Miley suggested, was aimed at having Didi disinherit her son and potentially leave her estate to Chichester. Didi did revise her will after John and Linda's disappearance, specifically disinheriting John. Miley also developed a theory regarding the fate of John and Linda. He posited that Chichester had convinced the couple he had secured government jobs for them in New York, arranging for them to travel east separately. Miley's theory suggested that John Sohus was likely killed by blunt force trauma before Linda's planned departure, and Linda may have been killed subsequently. After John and Linda vanished, Chichester remained in the Sohus residence for approximately 4 months, continuing his manipulation of Didi. Neighbors reported Chichester borrowing a chainsaw and burning something in the fireplace that produced a putrid smell around the time of the Sohus' disappearance. Another neighbor recalled seeing the backyard dug up and refilled. The investigation continued for years, facing obstacles such as the deaths of potential witnesses, district attorneys leaving their posts, and detectives moving on to other cases. However, the arrest of Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter in Boston in 2008 for the kidnapping of his daughter brought renewed focus to his past in San Marino. Following his arrest, California authorities revived their investigation into the Sohus case. Ultimately, on March 15, 2011, Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter was charged with the murder of John Sohus. This indictment came after Los Angeles County Sheriff's investigators stated they had accumulated sufficient evidence, including the positive identification of the remains found in Didi Sohus' backyard as belonging to John. At the time of the indictment, sources do not specify any charges related to the disappearance of Linda Sohus. One of Gerhartsreiter's attorneys stated that his client was absolutely innocent and would vigorously contest the murder charge. As of now, Linda Sohus remains missing, and her case is still unresolved. Authorities continue to seek information regarding her disappearance. Anyone with relevant details is urged to contact the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Cold Case Homicide Investigators at 1-323-890-5500. Following Christian Karl Gerhartsreiter's conviction, Sandra Boss focused on rebuilding her life with their daughter, Ray. After their divorce, Boss moved to London with Ray, where she continued her successful career. The relocation provided a fresh start, allowing them to distance themselves from the traumatic events associated with Gerhartsreiter's deceit and criminal activities. In London, Boss maintained a low public profile, prioritizing Ray's well-being and privacy. She continued her work in the business sector, demonstrating resilience and dedication to providing a stable environment for her daughter. Specific details about their personal lives post-relocation are limited, reflecting Boss's commitment to privacy and normalcy for Ray despite the challenges posed by Gerhartsreiter's actions, ensuring a secure and nurturing upbringing for Ray, away from the public eye and the shadows of her father's criminal past. For more information on this case, Nightwatch Files would like to recommend The Man in the Rockefeller Suit, The Astonishing Rise and Spectacular Fall of a Serial Imposter by Mark Seal, which heavily informed this episode. You can find a link on your preferred listening app's episode description. Dear Nightwatch Files crew, I wanted to reach out in regards to the Gilgo Beach Killer episode because this one really stuck with me. The way you laid out the timeline from Shannon Gilbert's frantic 911 call to the arrest of Rex Heuermann was both haunting and incredibly well researched. The part that really got me was how long it took for law enforcement to take these cases seriously. The way the victims were dismissed because of their backgrounds is infuriating, and it's crazy to think how many years this case was stalled due to corruption and incompetence. The details about James Burke and the internal dysfunction were just mind-blowing. I had no idea how much politics played a role in keeping this case in the dark for so long. Shannon Gilbert's story also really hit hard. Whether or not she was connected to Heuermann, it's tragic that she fought so hard to get help that night, only for her case to be brushed aside. It's heartbreaking to think about how different things might have been if she had been taken seriously from the start. I also really appreciate how you covered the victims' lives with so much depth. Too often, true crime stories focus entirely on the killer, but the way you told Maureen, Melissa, Megan, and Amber's stories made them feel like real people, not just names on a list. It made the whole case feel even more devastating. This was an intense but necessary episode, and I'm really grateful for the work you put into it. Looking forward to hearing more from you, hopefully with some cases that have better endings than this one. best, Rebecca Williams, Los Angeles, California. Hey, I just finished listening to your latest episode about Ramon Sosa and his unbelievable survival story, and I had to write in. This episode truly had me on the edge of my seat. The way you narrated Lulu's cold, calculated actions was both shocking and deeply unsettling. I still can't wrap my head around her laughing at those fake crime scene photos. Ramon's resilience is just incredible. The fact that he had to go through the psychological torment of sleeping under the same roof as someone plotting his murder is beyond comprehension. His ability to not only survive, but turn his experience into a way to help others is inspiring. It's wild to think that without Mundo's intervention, this story could have had a very different ending. Speaking of Mundo, what a fascinating character. His street smarts and loyalty saved a life, yet it seems like his involvement came with real consequences for him too. I'd love to hear more about what happened to him after everything unfolded. Thank you for bringing this story to light. I'll definitely be recommending this episode to friends. Looking forward to the next one. Dave Johnson, Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, USA.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.